I think there's a connection between resilience, insurance, and success.
Real estate agents and mortgage brokers apparently are far more qualified to understand insurance than a licensed insurance agent is in their own mind.
The insurance agent is going to be the advisor to future buyers, a lot more. And I hope we stand up to that challenge. When customers are not resilient, they have a greater chance of being in a disaster situation. It's just a matter of time.
Just because you didn't have your house get blown over by the hurricane, or just because you haven't had an auto wreck, doesn't mean that 87% of the state of Florida is uninsured or underinsured.
The codes are set to give you enough time to escape, to save your life, not to save the structure, not to save the building. If you want to save your building and your contents, you've got to be going above the code.
You're not going to get a discount in premium by griping. You're going to get a discount in premium by actually taking action and doing those things.
And these books are written for, every consumer to be able to understand. I'm trying to demystify and decomplicate the messages. Sometimes, the government and the industry talks in above our heads, and that's not very helpful.
We've been so busy trying to sell as opposed to educate that if we took the time to educate, the product would sell itself because somebody would feel much more comfortable with what they're buying, and they would view you as more of a trusted professional as opposed to a used car salesman who's just trying to get the next policy sold, collect the commission, and move on to the other person. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Power Producers Podcast, where we are refining and redefining the sales game. Today, I have a special guest, and we're going to talk about something relatively unique for what we normally talk about, but that does not mean that it's not important. Our guest is Aris Papadopoulos. He's the chairman of the Resilience Action Fund, but also an author. And he's got a pretty unique backstory and a message that he wants to get out to the insurance community, but I don't think that it necessarily needs to end there, because this applies to literally anybody who has any kind of property out there today. Aris, welcome to Power Producers. How are you today, sir?
Thank you, David. I'm great. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yes, sir. It's my pleasure. So before we get started and talk about what you're doing through the Resilience Action Fund, maybe talk a little bit about your background and what led you to start what you've started.
Thank you. I'm an engineer by training. I spent most of my career in the construction industry, over 25 years, built and was CEO of a billion-dollar-plus company. And I'm also a World Trade Center 9/11 survivor. Happened to be there on that day to meet with the Port Authority in the North Tower at 9 a.m. And we know the first plane hit that tower, about 12 minutes before that. But that kind of lit something. I was fortunate enough, God providing to save myself. But that lit something in my mind, and I asked myself, not so much why are the hazards strong, but why are the assets weak? Why are the buildings, being destroyed? And being in the building industry, I started looking at things, our homes, our cities, our buildings, everything we build in a different way. And that kind of got me alarmed and focused in this area. So I retired after the Great Recession, kind of gradually phased out, turned over the business to the people I had developed, and focused on what has become my passion, which is making every consumer, every business person, every household more educated on this topic, because most of our wealth is in property. And unfortunately, we have a systemic problem with vulnerable development. I tried from the inside when I was in the industry to change things, but it's climbing a very steep and difficult wall because there's a lot of money in development, as you know. And therefore, wherever there's money, there's resistance to change. So I decided and started a nonprofit called the Resilience Action Fund to go directly to consumers who ultimately bear the price, both personally and financially.
Interesting. So what kind of work are you doing with the Resilience Action Fund right now? I mean, certainly awareness campaigns is probably a large part of it, but what are you doing specifically to further your message?
Yeah, I've written two books. The first book was Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability, which I published a decade ago. The title is right behind me here, the cover page. And just last month, I launched my second book, Resilienomics, that really focuses on the economic picture for everyone. And these books are written for, every consumer to be able to understand. I'm trying to demystify and decomplicate the messages. Sometimes, the government and the industry talks in above our heads, and that's not very helpful. I've also made two documentaries and helped in a third. The first documentary, 2018, Built to Last with a question mark, that PBS has broadcast, I'd say at this point, over 1,000 times. They broadcast it every year. Then I helped a friend of mine make a second documentary, Last House Standing, that also has been shown on PBS. And this year we're launching a third documentary called Built to Last, Buyer Beware, that again focuses directly on consumers and has mostly been filmed on the Gulf Coast of Florida, from let's say Naples up to Tampa, up to Mexico Beach, Panama City, etc. Which we've seen a lot of damages, and people suffering losses in the past years, and to deliver the message of resilience to people. I appear on many news programs. Whenever they invite me to comment, West Coast, East Coast. I've talked about fires. I've talked about floods, even out of the country. I've been invited to speak, and my website contains a number of tools, useful tools. If you go to buildingresilient.com, you'll find a lot of useful tools like a buyer's guide to resilient homes. Unfortunately, the property industry doesn't guide us very well in picking a strong house. They focus on the cosmetics, they focus on the kitchens, the closets, the bathrooms, but not what's behind the walls. What wind will the house withstand? How easily does it flood? The disclosures are confusing and sometimes missing. So we don't know a lot of things, how easy a house will burn down. And people are realizing that after the fact, saying, I didn't know, this could happen to me. And that shouldn't be happening. People need to be more aware. In fact, I like to say we know more about the cars we buy, than the houses we buy. So, I'm trying to change the needle there. And I've also helped create a index to measure the resilience of houses that's been being launched internationally first through the World Bank. It's called the Building Resilience Index, but I hope to bring that to the U.S. In a couple of years, and maybe start in Florida, introducing it, that basically we can rate any building.
Yeah, I mean, Florida would be the place to start for certain. God knows we've got our fair share of issues down here. And I mean, Florida itself learned a lot just from Hurricane Andrew when it hit, because they changed the building code for a lot of things, but we're still not where we need to be in terms of the quality of construction and the way that homes are built, especially for as many people as are migrating down here with the whole tract housing that's being built and everything else. I mean, I don't even know where we start, but it's interesting when you look at other parts of the world and the types of things that they do to from a sustainability standpoint, and it doesn't sacrifice quality of construction. One of the things that I learned from what goes on overseas is I had a client of mine in the insurance industry that's a chain of furniture stores. And when you have a chain of furniture stores, that you have a lot of packaging that comes in. And when that packaging comes in, it happens to have a lot of styrofoam in it, right? And so styrofoam's a nightmare if you need to try and get rid of it from a furniture store, because one of the biggest expenses you have is the cost to have the compactor pulled, and you can only compact it so much. And when I started touring their distribution center and seeing how they were handling that, the CFO told me, he said, we realized pretty quickly that we were not going to be able to maximize our margins if we were constantly having to pay a waste company to take these compactors away. And so they had invested in a machine that you could put the styrofoam on it, and it had teeth that came down and chopped it up, and it ran it through a conveyor belt and through a heating element, and it would melt it, and it would turn it into liquid, a liquid styrofoam, plastic, whatever the actual material is, and it looked like a giant cow patty when it dumped it out. And the company who would sell you the machine would then also come and pick up all of that stuff, and they were turning around and selling those discs of of melted and then cooled down and solidified styrofoam to Korea, where they were shipping them and they were taking them and melting them back, forming them into blocks and using them to build houses with.
Hmm.
And the strength of that product was far superior, allegedly, to what you would normally get from a concrete block home or a frame home here. And I just, that's like 15 years ago they were doing stuff like that. So I can't even imagine the things that we don't see here that are happening in the other parts of the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, technology is part of it, but we know the building industry is very slow moving and very slow in adapting technology. I live in South Florida. I've lived in the Miami area now for over 25 years. And, I know that, we're building to the highest standards for wind in South Florida since Andrew, building to 180 miles an hour standard. So, I feel very secure about that. I'm not so happy with the flood risk we're taking. But the rest of Florida has not adapted that standard. How many decades after? I go to Tampa and I see buildings, apartments, second floors being built of wood, and I say, "What do you guys think? You think a Cat 4 won't hit you?" You know,
Right.
and
Well,
and
no, to be honest with you, that's exactly what they think. I live in Tampa. And I mean, until this last year, when we got unfortunately hit somewhat close, still not a direct hit to Tampa, between Helene and Milton, we really hadn't had much action in the last 20 or so years. The early 2000s, we had a few storms that sort of skirted by that hit in other areas more directly. But until we had that storm surge and the fallout that happened from the most recent year's worth of hurricanes, I really feel like people in Tampa just thought it's never going to happen to us. It always turns at the last minute. And that's a really dangerous game to play.
yeah.
And if you look there's so much of Tampa specifically that's older construction that really there's not much they're going to be able to do to improve it. Maybe there is, and you would be more of an expert by far at that than I would. But you're 100% right. Here we have an opportunity to rebuild and rebuild the right way, and in many cases, we're wasting it.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're in a denial. Obviously, the building industry, especially the speculative part of it, which is a big part of the home building sector and even the small commercial sector. I mean, they're not going to own it for many years. I mean, they're building it. They hope to flip it to pension funds or other investors, and then they're free, hands free. And it's I like to say we have so much vulnerable construction because first, it's legal. The law allows you to do it. Our codes and our regulations allow it. It's profitable. You can make good money, good profits by building and rebuilding, to that low standard. And third, the consumer, the buyer, doesn't know the difference. So the consumer's blind, whether it's the homeowner consumer or the business often consumer, moving into a building or something. They don't know what the risks are. So I'm trying to focus on that third element. We need to wake up the consumer because the consumer ultimately pays the cost. And I'm seeing that I've done a study the last couple of months because I've been invited this year for the first time to be the keynote speaker at the Tampa Regional Resilience Summit, which is happening mid-May in Tampa. It involves all the governments or municipal governments around Tampa Bay. And I was surprised they reached out to me because that's a sign that they're getting desperate. They're
Hmm.
getting because they know I'm tough on this subject. So they said, well, we got to invite them. We have no, we're our backs are against the wall. Um, and I've done some analysis of neighborhoods in the St. Pete area, comparing two neighborhoods, one that, has chronically been flooding again
Oh,
and
I could tell
again.
you, it's probably Shore Acres.
Exactly. And I visited Shore Acres, and in fact, we filmed a little bit. Our new documentary is partly filmed there. Some people who moved from the north during COVID didn't know anything, weren't told anything, and they flooded. And they flooded for the a year before Milton, and then they flood again in Milton, and now and so a lot of those people have lost money. Basically they've been forced to sell, and we've got all the statistics. And I compared it to a neighborhood that's about 5 miles in the center there of St. Pete, called Distant Heights, and the same people. And I'm focused on working class housing. So I was looking at homes that basically sold below 400,000. I'm not looking at the waterfront, $1 million people who sometimes have multiple homes and have a lot of liquidity. But the working class people in those houses in Shore Acres lost money. And the people that were in the higher elevation location, distant height, that's like 20 to 40 feet, uh, and have never flood. I mean, they made money at the same time, and the spread is quite astounding. So I'm planning to present that at this conference there, and basically show that real households are being hurt, and they're losing probably decades of their lives in terms of their savings potential and wealth potential, and the personal impact too that goes with it. But I'd like to turn to the insurance, organizations a little bit here, because I think there's a connection between resilience, insurance, and success. So I'd like, if the timing is good, to kind of focus a little bit our discussion there, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Go ahead, man. Lead the dance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what insurance people are becoming more important and relevant in this kind of new environment of disasters. And the success of an insurance professional, at the street level, let's say, the local level, and their organization is going to depend on getting, educated and knowledgeable and applying some of these resilience principles. In other words, making resilience part of your strategy, your business strategy. And let me start first at the personal level. Your own place of work. If your own place of work gets destroyed or severely damaged, I mean, that's going to severely impact your business and your success for some time, even if you're insured. And I assume you are. So picking a resilient location and a resilient building to do your business in is important. And I give a lot of the knowledge for that in my book, and we can, kind of highlight some points. But that's kind of the first level. The second level is your personal home. Are you living in a resilient house? Because if your household is damaged and the home is destroyed, I mean, that's going to affect your ability to act at top performance, and you're going to go through a lot of turmoil again, even if you have insurance. So that's important. And then your employees, if you have employees, are they in resilient houses? That's kind of at the inside level. How resilient is your own persona and business? So you start there and evaluate that. Then let's go to your customer base. Obviously, when customers are not resilient, they have a greater chance of being in a disaster situation. It's just a matter of time. And obviously, a disaster situation will lead to claims. Claims lead to time. You have to put in time, to handle some of those claims, to answer, concerns, to address issues, and so forth. That takes away from time to, develop business, new business. So that's a drain on your organization. It also can lead to a portion of customers being unhappy. Unfortunately, insurance companies are in the business to make money, and they're going to scrutinize all the fine print and find, how they can, cut their costs down to the lowest possible number. And that's going to make a number of people unhappy, because most people don't understand really all the fine print that's in these contracts. And obviously we need to explain to them more, but that is not the present situation. Most people say, I didn't know that this wasn't covered, or so it's going to lead to unhappiness.
Well, the reality is half the agents selling this stuff don't know what's in the contracts either. I mean, I mean, I'm call it like I see it. So,
Okay.
I think that for people to be able to understand that, they have to get educated. Now, I do feel like the average consumer has to be willing to be educated, and many of them typically shut down or aren't. But I also think that's a chronic problem of the insurance industry, because we've been so busy trying to sell as opposed to educate, that if we took the time to educate, the product would sell itself, because somebody would feel much more comfortable with what they're buying, and they would view you as more of a trusted professional as opposed to a used car salesman who's just trying to get the next policy sold, collect the commission, and move on to the other person. So I do feel like the insurance industry has a good bit of blame to take in all of this. But you're 100% right. People don't understand what they're buying, and they really should. I can't think of very many products out there that you're not going to understand exactly what the features, the benefits, the downsides are of what you're going to buy. That's the same general level of expense. I mean, I live in a very modest home for where we could live, but I do that because I have 4 kids, and my theory is I'm going to let them beat the crap out of the inside of the house until they move out, and then we'll go buy a nice house where we actually want to live. But my home is a single story ranch home. It's about 2,100 square feet. It was built in 1980. We've done every improvement we possibly could do that I'm aware of to make sure that if a hurricane comes, we have our best chance of taking as minimal damage as possible. But when I first started insuring the home, when we moved in back in 2011, we were paying about $1,200 a year for our homeowners insurance. And this past renewal, it was at $5,500. Okay. Coverage is about the same. They've actually taken a couple of things away. But my point is, how many things does anybody out there listening to this buy in their life for over $5,000 that you don't take the time to do a little bit of research and understand what it is? And I mean, you'll go into Best Buy and you'll let the guy explain all of the things about the TV that you need to understand before you make that purchase to bring it into your home, but you don't want to understand what the insurance does or does not cover. And a great example of where I think consumers really miss the boat on some of this stuff is flood insurance specifically. With the hurricanes that just came through, I live at literally the very highest point in Hillsborough County. The hill that is right where my neighborhood is the highest elevation anywhere in Hillsborough County. I've always carried flood insurance because I'm a firm believer that, just because you're not in a high risk flood zone doesn't mean you can't get flooded. And, I would rather, it just means I pay less for it than what I would if I was in a higher risk flood zone. Well, guess what happened? The hurricane came and the neighborhoods didn't flood because of the hurricane. The neighborhoods flooded because the dam that's over at Medard Park got to the point where it couldn't hold the water anymore, and they had to open the floodgates on the dam. And guess what? That water had to go somewhere, and neighborhoods that never in a million years thought they would ever see a flood event in their neighborhood were completely underwater for a matter of weeks after the hurricane. And these people had no flood insurance. And, I don't know, you can always make the argument, hey, their agent should have offered it to them because that is part of our job. We have a duty to offer in Florida. But how many times did the agent say, hey, I'm going to go ahead. Here's your quote for flood. Well, my bank doesn't require it. Or, I'm not really in a flood zone, so it doesn't make sense for me to buy this. And now these are the people that are screaming, hey, we need FEMA to come in and help us because we didn't have flood insurance or whatever the reason would be. It's not just because you live right there where the storm surge is going to be or wherever else. And I mean, even going back to Shore Acres, it floods when there's not a hurricane, man. You get a decent enough thunderstorm in the afternoon. The way that property's developed, it's going to flood. I mean, I've been over that in that area trying to cut through to go to a Rays game when it was at Tropicana Field, and it was an afternoon thunderstorm, and you couldn't even, some of the roads weren't even passable to cut through the back way to get to the ballpark. So I do think that we have to educate. I think people have to be receptive to that. And, the other thing is, from the insurance perspective, you know what? I'm gonna save that thought for a second. The one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking is I think it would be really good, and I know that we're way into the podcast at this point, but what's your definition of resilience? I mean, what are you actually talking about when you say resilience? Because I think that will help people understand what your point of view is, as opposed to the two of us just rattling things off.
Yeah. Yeah, I define resilience very clearly, and this is resilience for buildings. I mean, resilience is now being borrowed by many other, topics: energy resilience, health resilience, social resilience. But I'm purely focused on the built environment. So, two components to me are part of that. First is what I call physical integrity. In other words, the ability of the structure to withstand the hazard, whether that's Cat 4 winds, or a flash flood, or a fire, caused by whatever reason, to be able to withstand that. And second is what I call operational continuity. In other words, assuming the structure survived, can you continue to do business or live in it? And that sometimes requires taking some additional measures. For example, I have a full house generator. For my house, I'm connected to natural gas, and I have a backup to the natural gas, which is a 10 days propane tank. So, I'm prepared for a long outage. So, things like that. So, and if you live, depending on where you live, and people think, high winds just affect the coast, where we're seeing, any area east of the Rockies can be hit by tornadoes. There's no such thing as a tornado alley anymore. It's a whole tornado subcontinent, let's put it. Uh, and water can be anywhere. You could be near a dry creek, but if you're too close to the bottom of that creek, let's say, and I define that, I say anybody who's less than 10 feet from a water body, whether that's the sea or a lake or a river or even a dry creek, is at risk. I like to be at least 15 feet above that. Now you can look at the FEMA maps, but they're not good because FEMA maps are political. There's a lot of political kind of, massaging that goes into them. There are some independent organizations, and the one I use the most is called First Street Foundation. They've come up with flood factor as being in my opinion, of much more reliable, and the websites like Redfin, like Zillow, at the bottom of the listing, if you go near the bottom, you'll see the flood factor score, and if you're a 5 or above, you're high risk. And I tell that buyer, look elsewhere. Don't go to that location. Look in some other area. So there are sources of information to help you. Now, a lot of people, of course, are in existing houses, and they have a choice to make. But I see a lot of, we spend as a country, on average, $300 billion a year on renovations. That's a huge amount of money. And most of it, unfortunately, is cosmetic. We like to fix, the kitchen, the bathroom, maybe expand the room. But before you do any of that, you should be asking yourself, is my house strong enough? Do I need to strengthen it? And prioritize whatever renovation money you have on that first. Whether that's the roof. And I also tell people, and I make it clear in my book, that building to code is building to minimum wage.
Mm.
If you think that code is going to protect you, you're kidding yourself, and that's not something the governments make it clear to us. But being in the industry, I learned that, I know that that the codes are set to give you enough time to escape, to save your life, not to save the structure, not to save the building. If you want to save your building and your contents, you've got to be going above the code. And in
Mm.
part of our life do we go to the minimum, in education, in healthcare, in leisure, and yet in the most important part of our life, which is our home, we're by default at minimum wage, and most people don't realize that. They think, oh, it's code. It's, if the government said, okay, it must be good to, last. Well, it's not good to last. It's good to get you out, in time. So most people don't understand that. If you want to have a strong house and to protect your contents, you've got to be building and you've got to be renovating above the code. And there are ways to do that. There's a standard that's come out of the insurance industry. Hopefully your members may have heard of it. IBHS, the Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a testing facility in South Carolina where they test different structures, roofs, buildings, etc. And they've come up with a fortified standard that's above the code. And it's the first, I think, national standard, above the code. So in some states, like Alabama, for example, which has kind of led the way, they offer insurance discounts if you make your roof to the fortified standard rather than just building it to code. So, that's part of the education, and I think first, I'm hoping we can educate the insurance community so they can, be talking about it more effectively to their customers.
Yeah, I think that we've done about everything we can at my home. We put the best quality roof that we possibly could put on there. We did not, I mean, I could not have bought a better option based on what the roofing companies were offering. We also have put brand new windows and doors that are hurricane, rated, the top shelf for windows and doors. It actually helps save some money on the electric bill too. Like you, I also purchased a whole home generator. Unfortunately, we don't have a direct connection to natural gas that can be drawn off of our street. So I've got 500 gallons of propane in tanks that will power the house for up to 3 weeks if we use it the right way. Now, the bad part about that is about 30 minutes to an hour into Hurricane Milton coming through, the generator failed. And that was a known issue from Generac specifically, that they knew that the brushes on the motors were bad. They had learned that from Hurricane Beryl when a bunch of the generators failed in Houston. And all of that is tied back to a time during COVID when they decided to start buying those component parts from China. So rather than issue a recall, rather than put out any communication or have the people who come and service the thing quarterly, we just ran it every Wednesday for the 10 minutes you're supposed to run it. It worked, but what we found out was this specific issue was caused when it had to run for a prolonged period of time. And so I had a $20,000 boat anchor sitting outside my house the entire time of the hurricane. We still lost power. Now, again, I'm in the industry and I try and, be a problem solver. We were able to save our food and our other things because I found relatively inexpensive deep freezes at one of the appliance stores, and I bought 2 or 3 of them, brought them over to my office where we didn't lose power at all, loaded all of our stuff up in coolers, brought it over, kept it frozen until we got the power back at the house. And, people were like, why are you spending money on freezers? Well, guess what? Because I had several $1,000s worth of food, but I solved the problem for $450. That's why, that was the decision I made. So, I think that people need to think through things like that because, again, here, it's not a matter of if, but when. What are you doing? And I mean, your point's very well taken. Codes like, building to minimum wage. I 100% agree with that. And it's going to be interesting because I don't think it's been long enough for the claims all to be closing out and us to start getting a bunch of really accurate data and statistics on it. But the other thing that I would wonder is, how many people are going to get hung out to dry with ordinance and law claims because they didn't listen to their agent or they didn't see that they didn't have the coverage to bring everything back up, to code, whatever that means today. They're living in a home that was built similarly to mine in the early 80s, and they've not really had any issues. Now, we've had our plumbing upgraded, our electric upgraded, and all of that stuff to more modern day standards. How many people are going to get hung out to dry there? That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I'm going to say this, I don't want you to say something controversial, even though I can tell you probably don't mind if you do. But, the other thing is the political part of all of this stuff, right? So I look over at Johns Pass in Madeira Beach, in those places where people basically are just walking away. They're selling the home as is so that a developer can come in and get it at a pretty good price, knock down what was there and build something new. How much of that influenced, the political parties to pass the new building codes and things that they did post hurricane saying, oh no, you can't just build it as it was. You need to build it at this. But even to your point, that's not necessarily going to even be adequate. I have a feeling that we're going to find out that some of these developers and some of these politicians that pass this stuff are in cahoots with each other. And, the people, like you said, that lose everything end up losing everything, and the rich get richer because they're taking advantage of a negative situation.
Yeah, I like to say, particularly here in Florida, that living on a coast or living on the water is going to become only a rich man's sport. In other words, if I'm starting a family, or if I'm in a working middle class situation, I've got to pay attention to two things, because two things are important. First is where you decide to live or have your business, and second is what do you build? What's the building? And if you select a location that's high risk, it's going to cost a lot more, maybe 2 to 3 times more to make something resilient. If you select a location like you are on a high elevation point, and I'm also even though I'm in Miami, I'm at 15 feet, which is a mountain for Miami. It takes a lot less to spend to make something resilient. So I like to say, the starting families, the middle class, working middle class, we've got to put them on the safe ground. We've got to, make sure that they are buying, that they are living on the safe ground. If the rich people want to spend, their money and the risky locations, let them do that, I mean, I've seen a lot of people who have bought on the coast and some of these Bay Islands here in Miami, these waterfront properties. And I asked one of them, I said, how much is your insurance? He said, what insurance? He doesn't.
Yeah, it's crazy. They don't even insure it. I mean, I've seen that. I can't even tell you how many times people in multi-million-dollar homes on the coast, and they're like, listen, we just want a liability only policy. We're going to take the risk on the property.
He's got several homes, maybe even outside the country, has got the liquidity to address any disaster. So as I say, that's a rich man's sport. But the middle class, the working middle class, the starting families, let's make sure that they know where to live, and try to steer them. And I like to say, and here's what insurers could also add value. I advise people it's better to select and buy your house with an insurance agent than with a property agent. You
Yeah,
know,
no, I agree.
the property agent is going to do what for you? Just, tell you about how pretty this is, and the insurance agent hopefully can give you some useful information. Say, stay away from this neighborhood, or this house, has some vulnerabilities. If you buy it, you got to spend, X to, make it strong, and your insurance, will still be high, but whatever. So I think the role of the insurance agent is going to be the advisor to future buyers, a lot more. And I hope we stand up to that challenge.
I think, and that's an interesting, there's an interesting thing that goes on behind the scenes that I don't necessarily know the average consumer, would know or follow, but real estate agents and mortgage brokers apparently are far more qualified to understand insurance than a licensed insurance agent is in their own mind, right? Because we deal with this push and shove back and forth all the time. Now, I'm primarily commercial insurance, but we do write personal lines. It's just that the majority of our book happens to be middle market commercial here. And the number of times that you have a mortgage lender who wants to dictate to you what replacement costs should be on a home, because that's what the loan amount is, and they only want insurance for a certain amount, not understanding at all that there's a co-insurance provision in that policy, that if the house isn't insured to the appropriate value, not only are they not going to have enough money to get rid of the debris and take care of any demolition and then ultimately rebuild it, whatever the cost is at that period of time, but they're putting them in a situation where they're going to get penalized for it because they didn't insure to the replacement cost. And I mean, we have tools, we have replacement cost estimators that we use. It's not a perfect science either, but there's a reason why we recommend the amount that we recommend. Market value and replacement cost are two very different things in the insurance world. And it seems like you can't get people to wrap their head around that. It's almost always spun as, oh no, you're just trying to get the premium higher so that you make more commission. No, that has nothing to do with it. And you wouldn't tell me that at the end of a hurricane when you end up coming out of this thing and everything's taken care of. But I'm going to be the one you come to blame if we don't do it at replacement cost right now. And I mean, again, it goes back to the education piece. You have to know. And I think there's a chronic issue in the insurance industry where agents don't take their own continuing ed seriously enough. Then they're not staying on top of current trends. And as a result, they fall behind in what they can be relaying out to the general public. But the general public doesn't in many cases even want to try to know or understand, from my experience. Yeah. Right now we're dealing with a situation where there have been natural disasters globally. And the average homeowner that's not in the industry has no clue how reinsurance works. They don't understand that reinsurance comes into play and how ultimately that's the number one rate setter for all of the carriers that write. But when reinsurance takes a hit, everybody takes a hit. They also don't understand that it's a pooled arrangement. Just because you didn't have your house get blown over by the hurricane, or just because you haven't had an auto wreck, doesn't mean that 87% of the state of Florida is uninsured or underinsured, or, that we haven't had horrible loss ratios because of bad drivers at the carrier level, and that cost has to get spread out amongst everybody. And I've had people push back and say, I've paid for 15 years, never had a claim, and my insurance went up another $500 a year this year. And I'm like, you know what? You're lucky that you've never had to navigate that or deal with it, but it's there if you're ever going to need it. What would have happened if you bought a brand new home for $600,000 and a week later, one of your kids started a fire in the kitchen and burnt the whole thing down? You hadn't even paid a year's worth of premium yet, but you still would have had that entire loss covered. That's the nature of the beast. The insurance company's the one taking the gamble, not you.
Yeah. Well, because your podcast is kind of steered on the message of, what can make professionals successful in insurance. Let me give you kind of my, 2 cents, and you can tell me, if I'm kind of not, because I've studied insurance, as part of my efforts here, and read a lot about. If I was an insurance organization, let's say local or an agent, I would try to steer my portfolio toward resilience. In other words, if I would try to say, okay, this part of the city or county or whatever, I'm not even going to touch, because it's going to give me headaches. I'm not going to, my the company that's backing me up is not going to like me because I gave them all this business. Maybe they have set parameters too, but I try to steer, toward resilience. Therefore, I'd have to know what resilience looks like. And also, I'd be giving more advice to people who maybe, have things that they could do to improve their situation on doing them. When I was running a billion-dollar company and we manufactured products and have plants and offices and so forth, our insurer, which was a global insurer, would tell us 2 things. First, here's a list of things you have to do for us to insure you. Otherwise we're not insuring you. And number 2, here's a list of things that you might choose to do, and it'll give you a better rate, but it's up to you if you decide to do them or not. So we get that list, and definitely we do everything on list A, and we do try to do as many things on list B as we could, So and I appreciated that. I think they were very direct with us, and we had a great relationship, and we both understood the issue. So I think that's the kind of level of communication that we have to all kind of steer to, because this thing is a growing problem, and it's only going to get worse. And unfortunately, our stock plus even a lot of the new buildings that we're building are vulnerable, because we have a problem. And until the consumers wake up, things are not going to change because the politicians aren't going to change it. So let's at least try to get our own organizations in the insurance side to be part of that change toward improvement.
I think as we wrap up, because we're getting to the point where we need to close out, I think that you would be an excellent addition to any insurance association conference as a speaker on this topic. This is just not something agents hear. I mean, they're constantly looking for new people, new voices, new ideas to come out. And, I'm saying that specifically because I know that a number of the people who run those, independent agent associations across the country listen to the podcast. And I've spoken at the majority of those events across the country over the years. And so if you're listening to this and you're looking for a different point of view and somebody who's going to challenge the status quo, I would highly recommend that you reach out to Aris. I mean, this is a great conversation in just the very beginning, in my mind, of the industry hearing this stuff. It needs to be perpetuated and talked to amongst ourselves, moving forward, or we're never going to go anywhere. And the insurance industry does not move fast at all, but everything that you're saying is exactly what the industry should be looking to achieve to control overall performance, right? People don't want to have claims. They don't want to have to deal with all of that, and the insurance companies obviously don't want to have claims. It makes them less profitable. So we need to table this conversation and just say, look, these are the things that you can do. Like you said, this is what you have to do. These are the things you could do that will even give you a credit on your premium. We're seeing that right now. We have one specific carrier on the personal side. My son who handles personal lines here at the agency brought me a quote a little bit earlier for a $600,000 house, brand new construction. and the premium's $1,200. Like, that's unheard of. Now, granted, it takes everything you said into consideration. It's in a popka. It's not on the water. It's, right in the middle of the state. There's nowhere near as much exposure perceived there. The construction is completely different than the average home that's in the general area. And there are things that were done to that home specifically to upgrade it and make sure that it was going to be able to withstand, whatever might be thrown at it, or at least have a fighting chance to do that. And that's the reward, right? You're not going to get a discount in premium by griping. You're going to get a discount in premium by actually taking action and doing those things. One of the things I wanted to ask you before I let you go, technology's changing quite a bit too in some of this stuff. And I'm an angel investor, typically in InsurTech, but I do look at other things that get brought to me. And I had an interesting company presented to me about 6-8 months ago that is now creating homes with 3D printers. Have you looked into any of that stuff at all? And how does that play into what your messaging is? Because I was led to believe that they can build them faster and stronger than what we're able to do now. And it's more eco-friendly because they're using materials that are either recycled or repurposed to make these homes.
Yes, David, I'm very familiar with that whole construction technology, contact as it's called for short. In fact, it's a whole chapter in my new book. I discuss all the different technologies, even examples of the companies and their strategies. Some strategies are failing, some strategies are succeeding. It's early days in this development. I think definitely has a role to play because labor is becoming more difficult. The skills are not as they were decades ago. Quality control, accuracy, waste materials, time is an important factor, construction time. So, technology, I think, is part of the solution. However, we shouldn't use technology as an excuse to not be resilient. In other words, we know how to build resilient. It's not that we don't know. We're just not doing it. And we're not doing it because speculative development is aiming to keep as much profit on their side as possible and passing the future costs and liabilities to consumers and communities and so forth. And I also want to thank you for putting the plug for me. I'm happy to talk to any insurance organization. And I do recommend to everybody to, look at this book, Resilienomics, and also the first book, but this book is kind of up to date on a lot of things. It's available on my website, buildingresilient.com. If anything arises from our discussion here today with the industry, I'd be happy to help because I think the insurance industry needs to be part of the solution here.
Absolutely does. How do they get a hold of you? What's the best way for them to reach out?
Basically through my website. Also, you can post my email, resilienceaction1@gmail.com on your site. So the website and the email, they can reach out to me. I'm also on LinkedIn. They can message me there if they use that. So those would be the three kind of choices.
Good deal. Well, that's a wrap, people. I think that we have beat this thing to death. It was really an interesting topic, a great conversation, and certainly one that needs to be furthered. I would encourage you, if you want to learn more, number one, go buy a copy of both of Aris's books. I know that I'll be doing that very quickly after we get off of here and reading through, because we've just barely scratched the surface talking for 45 minutes. But the other thing is, recommend to your local association, or if you are an association president or leader, reach out. I think that agents would like to hear, what he has to say, because it challenges a lot of what we see every single day. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to make our industry better, is the people who's challenge the status quo as opposed to complying with it. So thank you sincerely for taking time out of your schedule to come and join me today. And I look forward to putting this out so everybody gets a chance to hear you. Everybody else, we'll catch you next time around. See ya.